Okay, hi. We're a couple minutes early, but for those of you who are here, feel free to chat in the chat window in response. Here's a question to get us started tonight. So we'll start talking at about five past 6, between 5 and 10 past 6. And in the meantime, if you're here, keep you occupied and to get us in the mindset of what we'll be talking about tonight. Please go ahead and read this question or series of questions and chat. Hi, Susie. Hi, Sandra. Excuse me. Thank you. Thank you. Goodness. Excuse me. Hello? Hi. Okay, so I'm on the phone with Maria, and I'm trying to get her to join the Zoom call as well. So it could take me a couple minutes. In the meantime, good evening, everyone, and welcome. If you would, if you can see my screen, you can see my screen, right? If you can, perfect. So then would you please just take a look at those questions, think about them, and do some chatting in the window so we can see what each other's thoughts are. And then we'll start talking to each other in about 5 or so minutes. And while you're doing writing, I'm going to see if I can get Maria to join us as well. Okay? Let's see. So you won't hear me because I'm going to talk to her on the phone. All right, bye. Hello? Hello? Okay. Are you guys there? Oh, good. You can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you. I thought I dropped you all when I was getting off the phone, so thank you, thank you. All right, but I don't see anyone's responses. Is this because the question is premature? Is it a hard question? I noticed that that people were, there's Mindy, okay. Maybe you're just thinking. I did notice though, just so everyone else knows, is I noticed that people hadn't posted yet for this week in terms of the quick write, so that was implying to me that people maybe have not yet had a chance to view the slides, which is fine. But I just wanted to know so I can know what we're talking about here. Thanksgiving, exactly. So let's start with what Mindy's saying. And then if anybody else wants to write in the meantime, please feel free. And if not, then we'll start here and we will go from there. Okay. All right. So happy Thanksgiving, post-Thanksgiving. I hope everyone had a nice time. We did over here. So the question was, what kinds of classroom tasks come to mind when you think of higher order cognition? And then I just asked you to describe a task that you think places demands on higher order cognition in your classroom or in what you've observed. Thank you, Susie. And then to also mention what kinds of student challenges you've observed in relation to this task or tasks. So Susie, I'll ask you the same thing, and Kate as well. So if categorization of similarities and differences or student reflections place demands on higher order cognition, where do you see that breaking down for kids? And are there certain kind of common moments or points of difficulty that you've observed kids to encounter? Because those are the ones, of course, we're going to want to think about and talk about while we're together. And I'll read Mindy's now as well while you guys are thinking. So Mindy says, summary, recall, and memorizing are not HSC tasks, but analysis, synthesis, argument construction, and evaluation are typically yes. Students engage in these when they answer open-ended questions that have many reasonable answers, when they provide evidence to justify their thinking, and when they critique the reasoning of others. Students struggle if and when they do not have sufficient context for analysis or when the parameters are unclear, or when they don't have a good model or exemplar. Some students do, Mindy. Mindy, if you have a specific kind of anecdote about that, that would be helpful for us in terms of using some concrete information about what it looks like when kids are struggling. Let's see. I think from kindergarten, tasks that place demands on higher recognition often involve tasks that are more student-led. Interesting. At the kindergarten level, I would agree, right? Open-ended questions are more higher order for those young ones. Kindergarten independent writing that requires some sort of reasoning, I would think, would be higher order for them. Yeah, so that, I appreciate you bringing that up, actually. Some students should struggle with understanding language. Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So making inferences, that's something that's like specific and different, quite difficult. Susie, yeah. In fact, that's exactly where we were going to go tonight, is that it is difficult to separate higher order tasks from memory language, or really to think of higher order tasks independently of any of the constructs is nearly impossible, because it's about kind of taking up ideas and using them. And so that starts to involve and include multiple constructs at a time. Mindy, thank you. Struggle can look like a student who is reading a text that does not have obvious connections to their life. And those connections are not made for them or outlined for them. Perfect, thank you. That's a very lovely, concrete example, Mindy, thank you. Alex says, problem solving is explaining their reasoning. You know what, Kate and Alex, I do too. Have I mentioned that I have a second grade daughter who loves to do, mathematics is not her affinity area, but she can do the math work that she's assigned at school. However, she has a very strong opinion that she wants to do her math work in her head. However, when she has certain assignment problems that then ask her to explain her reasoning at the bottom of the page, she's basically, it's like she's a great writer and she's extremely articulate, but for some reason explaining her reasoning is her Achilles heel intellectually. And I feel that while it is a higher order task and she engages in lots of higher order tasks, the math problems are a higher order task that are not within her area of interest or experience of mastery, and therefore those higher order tasks that are embedded in mathematical reasoning are much less appealing to her and are more stress inducing and anxiety provoking. So it's something to think about. Part of that is a classroom context. It's possible, Cindy. It's also, so yes, of course, they want the right answer in class. She also, though, my daughter in particular, she just huge resistance to writing down her thinking. Yeah, so I think, especially with this transition to the Common Core, so one of the things I wanted to kind of raise tonight is that with the transition to these more kind of Common Core oriented standards and ways of teaching, as we've moved beyond the strict procedural emphasis that dominated in the last kind of decade or so, with No Child Left Behind, as students are now being asked to engage in a lot more tasks that place demands on higher order thinking, in particular explaining reasoning and mathematical thinking, suddenly we're starting to see a lot of places of breakdown for students that were able to kind of get by or perform certain tasks earlier and are now struggling in school and in testing. So in upper grades, that can look like older kids that did quite well in procedural work, and that now that they're being asked to engage in this kind of more conceptual way of thinking and these higher order tasks of explaining reasoning and critical thinking and independent problem solving, the older kids don't have early childhood background in doing that kind of work because they were in school during this transition. But also for younger students like first grade, kindergarten, second, who have only been in school since the Common Core standards have been out and since this kind of new approaches to teaching have been there, it turns out it's still actually difficult, right? So even if it's not the first time you're being introduced to explaining your reasoning, it's not a straightforward task. And I don't know how many of you have tried. I myself, because of my daughter's own resistance to writing down her reasoning, I myself have tried to write down or to put into words my mathematical thinking, especially for math problems that I do mentally, and it's not straightforward. Those kinds of demands on kids didn't used to be following them into math class, and often not in science class, and sometimes not in social studies either. And now they really do. And I think ultimately there's a policy push that makes a lot of sense with that, but then there's also the on-the-ground visibility of how difficult it can be for kids, especially kids that are struggling with English or learning to acquire English and or struggling with language more generally, or all kinds of social interactions. So I see this here. So I'm seeing a couple things. So Alex and Linnell are saying that inferences and explaining reasoning are different. Can you hold on just 1 second, okay? Hey. Okay, sorry about that. Neighbors popped over. Where were we? Okay, so some of these ideas of, I'm seeing inferences, identifying, so I'm going to write these down. So HSC tasks that present difficulty. So we have inference, drawing inference. We have explaining reasoning. And I'm going to write drawing inferences, social studies, middle school. I'm going to say first grade. These are just examples. And I'm going to write first grade math because I was talking about math, not that Alex wrote that. And Mindy is writing, explaining meaning and making connections to text. And that happens all the time. But let's say, do you mind if I write upper elementary grades? If that's inappropriate, please tell me. Because what I was curious about is, well, there's a couple things. One is, if we can think of, let's start with this drawing inferences in, actually let's talk about explaining reasoning in math in first grade first for a couple minutes. And what I was hoping we could do is just think about what other constructs do we think are involved in being able to explain reasoning in mathematics. So there's higher order thinking that's involved in that, but I think we've alluded to it. That's actually not the only thing involved in explaining your reasoning in first. That's right. So I'm going to ask you guys number sense. So, and Alex, in terms so expressive language, I'm going to ask you if when you're chatting about constructs, if you name them, see if you can kind of give us like, what about that? So I'm going to do that for you, Alex. We have language, and I'm going to write expressive. Does that make sense? Mindy's writing number sense, which I'm going to write in terms of the way we talk about numbers in this neurodevelopmental framework is talking about sequential ordering, and then I'm going to write number sense just to frame it. No problem, Alex. Susie says memory and attention. What aspects of that, Susie, if you can explicate for us, that would be quite helpful. Or if anybody else wants to kind of raise what aspect of memory or attention is involved in explaining reasoning. Place value. Ah, nice. Long-term. Okay. So long-term memory in terms of what you did to solve the problem. recalling steps. Great. To explain. And attention. So attention can be involved, but I'm curious, it can be like an easy or a typical kind of catch-all, like, oh, there's inattention. But it's useful, especially within, when using this framework and this work, it's really useful to try and hone in on the like very particular ways that attention makes its way into that task, just for as a mental exercise. Let's see, I think with attention, a lot of them are exhausted. Yeah, I think there's some of that. Stamina. Oh, got it. Okay, great. So that seems like consistent what you guys are saying. So there's mental, I'm going to call that mental energy here, just because that is how it's posed in the framework, which means stamina. I feel like students with interest when they don't understand. Right. So that's exactly why I'm saying that, is that kids are often labeled as inattentive for a variety of reasons, but typically there's like another kind of more pressing issue underlying that. There's kids that just struggle with attention for attention's sake, but more often than not, a lack of attention is a consequence or a manifestation of a different underlying difficulty, and so that's what I'm trying to get us to hone in on. Exactly. Susie, that I understand what you're saying. So in something like CGI, you guys, I love CGI too, by the way. That connects to what we learned in the first course. Mindy, what do you mean by that, just so I know? You mean what I was saying about like often attention, what looks like an attentional weakness is really the result of a struggle in a different area? Mm-hmm. So then, and you can take your time to, right, you know what, exactly, I was about to go to this idea of higher order cognition too. So because it could be, sometimes the difficulty explaining reasoning is that the reasoning itself is kind of weak, like the student does not have a firm grasp of how that problem was solved and why. They may have been able to arrive at the correct answer, but that doesn't mean they're confident in that answer, or they really get the concept in a way that they can then explain it. So it could be higher order cognition, problem solving, reasoning. That's valid. Mindy, you were saying, sorry, I was just saying CGI is amazing. Yes, but with CGI, the reading level issues and the language involved in CGI math is very, in multiple strategy, is very significant. You're committed, Mindy, when students practice explaining their thinking over and over, it's not so much higher order thinking, it's just routine. Mindy, will you pop on the phone and explain what you mean by that? Because I have a, if you can, otherwise you can write it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Is that what you mean by pop on the phone?
I'm sorry?
Oh, okay. So you mean just talk like this, right?
Yes, just tell us. Everyone can hear you, right?
Well, it starts with the little things like turn and talk, like tell your partner what you think, what you see, what you notice that so-and-so did on their paper. Tell your partner what, how you solved it. Tell your partner why you think we would start with that many cupcakes. When it starts with just the turn and talks, and then later it becomes like, okay, show us your strategy and how you got there. So it starts with the little things and it just becomes habit, and it's not so much of like a big chore or like, let me think, why was I thinking this? It just kind of cascades.
I see what you're saying. Okay, so thank you, first of all, for explaining that. Here's why I asked you, because to me, by having that established routine and having students really familiar with it and comfortable with it, it's very likely to kind of bypass these other difficulties students might encounter with, for example, expressive language, choosing the appropriate vocabulary, with attention, knowing what their task is supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to be doing in the task. There's some amount of, we didn't put this in there, but like social cognition that kind of comes into explaining reasoning, especially orally. However, it does, or can, it doesn't necessarily, but is hopefully likely to maintain the higher order features of the task, because explaining reasoning is actually about reasoning. So that kind of establishment of a routine and ways of going about practicing, talking about mathematical thinking from where I sit actually allows the higher order components of the task to be what the task is about, as opposed to including and involving all of these other dimensions that can get in the way and form a barrier but aren't necessarily contributing to thinking. Yes. Yes. Making higher order tasks routine can make a huge impact for kids that get tripped up with activities and tasks otherwise, and also those kids that are struggling with higher order thinking. So it gives them a way to kind of break down, like the think, pair, share that Mindy was talking about. It then gives those kids who might be struggling with higher order thinking in and of itself an opportunity to listen to peers, to think about what someone else is saying and how they approached a problem, to practice using the academic vocabulary necessary to explain reasoning, to get a chance to check their ordering and number sense by talking to a partner first. There's a lot of benefit to having kids have a routinized way to approach higher order tasks because it is so complex often. Does that make sense? The other place, well, we'll talk about, I don't want to get too far. Okay. So the social aspect, I'm just going to write talking to partners. And the other place that like that kind of idea is about routines is useful is something like there's like concept maps. If you think about like what those look like, graphic organizers, I'm confident that people have noticed in your own practice that as kids get used to using like the same or similar type of graphic organizer, it allows their thinking to be the thing that they're focusing on as opposed to like where the bubbles go and what kind of lines you draw between it and how does this work and how does that work and how big does this need to be spatially or not. There's a lot of other kind of distracting features of scaffolds and supports for higher order thinking that are really useful to bypass by giving kids opportunities to practice and engage regularly. Yeah, exactly. So just something to think about. I also appreciate maybe what you're saying about the conceptual math, and that's the kind of CGI oriented. Do people know, is there anyone who does not know what CGI means? I know we like explained what it stands for, but I'm more than happy to either give a quick rundown or have one of you explain to each other, because I don't like to leave people out due to acronyms in the field. Okay, who wants to tell Veronica a quick rundown of CGI? It means cognitively guided instruction. Anyone can pop on the phone, and if you don't, I'm going to do a quick, but all right. So, okay. So I never taught using CGI. So I'm going to say some things, and then people who are using CGI, thank you, Mindy, can either correct me or add on. I have been exposed to CGI approaches to teaching in the last like 6 years or so, but I've been out of the classroom for about that long. So basically, it's about a conceptual emphasis on mathematical thinking and learning, such that instruction itself it's the constructivist approach to learning, so that students are given the kind of ideas about the conceptual ideas they're going to need to engage in problem solving, and then they're guided to do mathematical thinking and talking about numbers as their approach to learning, as opposed to introducing an algorithm and having someone practice a certain number of problems using that algorithm. For example, students would be guided to derive an algorithm from problems that they had already solved, and then that way they're doing the conceptual work of understanding why the algorithm is used to resolve certain kinds of problems. Exactly. Thanks, Mindy. Okay, good. This small question. Can anyone else hear my daughter yelling? Because I'm about to go tell her to stop, but is it just... CGI classrooms are the most inclusive classrooms I've seen. I would agree. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the only place that CGI, I think, can be problematized is in what actually all of you were saying, which is that it places high demands on language. And so in classrooms where I have seen students with language-based learning disabilities or students with limited English proficiency, where their scaffolds are not put into place to allow them full access to participation, CGI can kind of miss them because there's so much language and talk going on among the kids that if a kid is for some reason shut out of being able to engage in learning through talk, then they're kind of shut out from learning math. And so I think that it's just something to keep in mind that CGI classrooms are inclusive in terms of being open to multiple ways of thinking and solution strategies. And if you're leading a math discussion, it's particularly important to account for the language needs of the students in your class. Great. Susie, do you have any examples of the kind of scaffolds you have used? Because I think that might be useful. So Susie's saying right there, like, I've had great success with students with language impairments using CGI if scaffolds are in place. I'm going to guess it's things like word balls and sentence starters, but right, sentence starters, exactly. So there's all that. There's also like using visual supports. So some kids might, if they're talking about math, kids that are struggling with language might have concrete items in front of them to support their thinking around the mathematics, and then they're more able to engage in group charts. Exactly. Yeah, CGI is it's very much about tools. People that are not familiar with it, I highly suggest just Google it when we get off the phone. It's cool, in my opinion. There's a lot of approaches to mathematics, and this is one that I really appreciate in particular. And I also encourage you all, which I don't have you for all the year this year, but if I did, what I would be doing is making sure that you get very used to drawing on each other for resources and knowledge. So I encourage you to contact each other, like look at who's saying things you want to know about, and then you can use a discussion forum. You can ask me to open one. You can contact the peer individually because you all know more about lots of stuff than I do. And so I just want to make sure that we draw on the full range of knowledge represented in this group. Okay. So I'm going to move. Wow, our time goes really fast. I just like talking to you. So we have this idea. So here we have this one task, right? Explaining reasoning in first grade math. And then look, that could be tasks that are involving language, ordering, memory, attention, higher order cognition itself, social cognition. There's all kinds of stuff that could potentially be involved in that supposedly higher order task. So the kind of question is how we can end up, how to hone in on the particular constructs that may be presenting difficulties for kids and or the constructs that need to be scaffolded for particular learners in the classroom. So this is going to start to dovetail with your three-part learning activity assignment that you have for this course. So you went through, and I read your part ones, and I'll take questions on that in a couple minutes because I want to make sure everyone feels all set for moving on to the other parts of the assignment. But as of now, you should all have some kind of feedback from me, and you've all done this task where you say, you know, here's a student in my class, Pedro, here are his expressive language challenges, here is his receptive language strengths, here's another child, these kinds of things, right? So as you've done that, now you kind of have going into this higher order cognition portion of this course, you have in mind some of the language strengths and challenges of students that are in your class or the students that you observe for this assignment. What I'm going to ask you to really think about and watch for this week and over the next 2 weeks that we have left in the course is I encourage you to follow those particular kids. You don't have to do anything formal with it, okay? But I want you to kind of keep an eye on those people. And I'm going to ask you to think about the relationship between their language, either a strength or a challenge, an expressive or receptive language, and their engagement in higher order cognition tasks. Because you have that template there already. They're your kids. So you know, I'm guessing you already kind of have many thoughts on them and know them quite well by this point in the year. But if you force yourself to really kind of look through the lens of the intersections and the connections across constructs for a particular person, it can really open up space for how you identify the particular scaffolds and supports that are going to help that person or a subgroup of kids in your class that have similar or related challenges. So for example, if you have a kid who has an expressive language strength, when you do the higher order cognition section of your template for part 2 of the assignment, you may notice that that person has a higher order cognition weakness. For some reason, you might identify, here's a person I know who's actually quite strong with expressive language, but really breaks down with critical thinking and problem solving. Because you know, because you already thought through whether or not that person has a strength or challenge in expressive language, you can kind of say like, well, I'm going to guess the cause of the breakdown in higher order thinking here is not language. It's not expressive language. It might be receptive language. It might be something else. It could be memory. It could be attention. It could be social. It could be higher order thinking, but it's likely not language. So that gives you kind of a suite of strategies that you would be less likely to offer to that student. If you have a student with an expressive language strength, but a weakness in critical thinking and problem solving, that's not a person you would need to give a sentence starter to engage in a think, pair, share for a problem, right? That's a person that you would be more likely to give some kind of flow chart so that they can map out the steps they took to solve a problem, and that would allow them to then use their expressive language strengths to get that message across to others. So the reason why it's useful to think about the constructs individually, even though they intersect all over the place, is because it allows you to then hone in on those kind of points of entry to really support learning. And we're just playing with that notion using language and higher order cognition because those are the constructs that we're talking about during the 6 weeks in the course. But I certainly don't want to deliver the message to you or impart to you some misperception that the constructs, that only those 2 constructs have intersecting features, because they all do. Yeah, Mindy, if you create a flowchart visual, then please share it with me. Did you guys all did you do a learner profile on yourself in Erin's course, in course 1? So, okay, good. So then we all know we have like relative strengths and weaknesses, right? Just like everybody does. So full disclosure, well, you might be able to guess even from these couple sessions with me. I have language as a strength area for me. Spatial ordering is it's just a challenge, relatively speaking, for me, right? So I'm not going to be on a scale with spatial ordering, like the size of the letters I form on the page are appropriate and all that kind of stuff. However, in my field of academia, I'm just like the worst person to make a flowchart or a schematic or a visual representation of what I'm doing, I think, in paragraphs. So I mentioned that really for no reason, except I saw Mindy was talking about creating a flowchart visual. Anyone who wants to make some visual representations of that like summarizes or synthesizes what we're talking about, please do, because I'll never do it. I will do lots of lists like this for you. I'll have all kinds of tasks, but it will not be something else. Perfect. All right, sounds good. Okay, so that said, I just really want to make sure I check in with you about the lesson planning assignment, because you have part 2 that is going to be due at the end of this week, and part 2 is really just the same task you did for part 1, but using the construct of higher order cognition as opposed to language. So you may pick the same kids, you may pick some different kids. My suggestion to you is that if you are able to select the same students, like if you see something interesting about the same kids that you talked about with language, that can be That's my idea of fun. That could be a fun mental exercise, but you don't have to do that. You could pick different kids if you want to. Should you use the same document? I would, Alex. You don't have to, but it's helpful for me because I don't have everyone's kids like memorized, and that way I can kind of look across, and then you can just keep it all in one. Also for yourself later, when you do the learning activity or like a kind of scaffold or strategy for the students, it'd be nice to see it all housed in one place. Other questions about that assignment? No, you can't come here. You can take a marker. And we gotta go. Mom's working. Okay. Mindy says, one time we pulled some of the most common issues from the prim. Okay, good. I don't know what the prim is, or the P. I'm assuming that's how the acronym is pronounced. Pre-referral, thank you. Oh, the big, thank you. Thank you. You can tell I've been out of the classroom a while. Which numbers to choose based on student strengths? I have like 100 things. Yeah, so that's very similar. Did Erin mention to you the spiral? That's it, okay. So Mindy, I hope everyone's reading what Mindy wrote because that's what I'm responding to right now. So in this idea of what kinds of issues to address and scaffolds and strategies to put in place, looking at student strengths as a starting point is highly aligned with the way this work occurs. So Mindy, can you give us an example if you remember any, just so that it's for everyone? Some people are not in special education, some people. Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to talk?
It would be like, the behavior, the way the prim is organized is like the behavior is, and so the behavior would be like not completing tasks in class, like a very general behavior, and then it would have like 120 things to try to do. But what we did was we looked at them and we would select like, okay, let's say your student is strong with their motivation level, then you might want to select numbers 23 and number 27. Let's say your student is strong at expressive language, kind of like what you were saying. I mean, it wasn't that sophisticated.
Yeah.
We're like, then you could choose like number 101. So we were just trying to narrow, because it's such a big book and so many strategies. We were thinking about it the way you're saying, and the only reason that came up for me was because when I heard you say that, I was like, that's really the only time I've ever tried to take a stab at what you just described, and it makes me want to go.
Yeah, go back and do it again. I mean, that's a great, thank you for that example, by the way. That is exactly what I'm talking about. And that approach, it's funny, I teach pre-service teacher candidates at UC Irvine, and I am just laying the groundwork with them now intentionally, like the way you teach is to think about student strengths, challenges, and interests, and then you look at the content that you're wanting to get across to the kids, and then you make it match. And you can use, not all kids in the classroom need that in order to participate, right? There's going to be depending on your classroom, often like a fairly large subset of kids that can kind of take in information, process information, and manipulate information without, even if it's not ideal for them, they can handle it without accommodations or some kind of scaffold. And then there's everybody else who needs them. So taking even some tasks like what you're talking about, Mindy, it doesn't mean, right, that like the strategies will always work for particular kids that reflect those kind of similar areas of struggle, but it really gets you, it's like you're starting at mile 15 of the marathon instead of mile 1, because you've already ruled out a lot of what's unlikely to be useful at all. And I actually think that, to me, just between me and all of you, that is the most fun part of teaching. That creative act of locating what it is that's going to serve a person, a child, such that they're able to engage in learning, to me, is really exciting. So I encourage you all to kind of play around with it and get experimental with it. Some of that MTSS and kind of data-driven instructional decision-making work is also quite nicely aligned with this way, right? So it's about all right, collect some data, see what's going on with students in the class, introduce a potential support, and then take a look, did it work, did it not work, how and why. So this approach that I'm talking about is very similar to that. It's just typically at a more individualized level, and it's using the constructs as the lens through which we're observing kids and thinking about places to identify strategies. It's really those 8 constructs in the framework are the delineations of how to approach observations of kids rather than other ways of other kind of designations or other kinds of struggles or academic content areas. Great. Okay. Does anyone have any other just questions? Because we have, probably going to let you go early, actually. Does anyone have any like questions that are coming up, has come up with the work or with the assignments or anything? Because while we're together, I'm just going to put it out there, just like in the classroom with kids. If you're wondering something, I could pretty much guarantee you're not the only one. So I just want to make sure. I've tried to make everything as clear as humanly possible, but I don't want to leave you in the lurch. Okay, chat it in if you have anything else. And there's just a couple more things I want to tell you. One is when you watch Craig Pullman's video this week, and when you watch the slides, the 7 features of the system, you may notice that there's some kind of discrepancy in the language, the vocabulary used to describe the features of the system. So I just rewatched Craig Pullman today. I've seen that video many, many times, but I was like, oh, I should watch it too. And I picked up on it that, so for example, I think in the slides I have one of the features of higher order cognition is in reasoning and logical thinking. And Craig Pullman talks about it as applied reasoning and things like that. So then there's like conceptualization and concept maps and creativity. He uses these words, many of which are featured in the slides, but to the extent you see like a bit of departure from it looking identical, that's really just about the growth of the work a little bit around neurodevelopment. So Craig Pullman has taken some of the work around those constructs in a slightly different direction than the way the constructs were originally laid out. And so some of that vocabulary around that. And some of it's just choice of how to kind of rework the construct of higher order cognition itself. So I mentioned that for the big reason that I just don't want you to be like, these are different and how do they connect? They do connect. Just look for the connections, please. All the same kind of content and areas, the same, it's just how we're talking about it. And the other reason is that I encourage you to do actually what Craig Pullman has done and what I have tried to make clear in my conversations with you, which is that like use this work in ways that is useful to you. So for Craig Pullman, talking about the features of the system in the terms he uses works in his practice. He's a psychologist, he's a psychologist. And so those kinds of terms overlap with the other terms he uses that are not from the neurodevelopmental framework. For you as teachers, you know, some people, you're going to see stuff that's like higher order cognition. Some things are going to say, you know, higher thinking. Some things are going to say high level thought, something. So it's really kind of a vocabulary issue with that. So I just want to like draw your attention to that and kind of tell you, I know too, and don't worry about it. But if you have questions or things seem to not overlap, but in fact seem to contradict each other, please tell me and we'll resolve that with you. And the only other thing I kind of wanted to get across to you that is not going to come up for part 2 of the assignments, that will come up in part 3, and I want to give you a bit of a heads up of thinking about it now, is similar to what we did tonight, where I was kind of pursuing people's thoughts to ask you to get really concrete and give me an example from practice of like the particular task the student could or couldn't do. I want you to keep doing that in your thinking, and I also want you to include content areas, because it's very common, in fact it's uncommon, for there not to be variation in how an individual brings their strengths or challenges to different content areas. So for example, as I mentioned, I'm a person who has a strength with language, right? So I've always done really well in courses and thinking that are language-based, and I also have an affinity and an interest in history and culture and things like that. So I did quite well in history class, and I did, you know, pretty well across the board. However, the place that I really struggled was in English class, because I happen to have a language strength, but I also really don't do particularly well with like analogies and literary devices. I'm a literal type of thinker in my own experience, and so while I'm a person who's strong in language, believe it or not, that showed up least in English class. My language strength really helped me in math class, actually, because I'm a person who's really good typically at explaining my thinking and reasoning and talking things through, and writing problems out and getting help by asking for help using the appropriate mathematical terminology, things like that really supported my thinking in math, my language strength. But my language strength, my version of it, didn't help me particularly with metaphor. So the reason I mention this is that not only is it complex, because the constructs themselves are intersecting and people have various strengths and weaknesses along them. Because of the power of interest, affinities, and personal knowledge based on those interests and affinities, a person with a strength in a construct might not show up in all content areas as having that construct be really featured as a strength. So the more you can force yourself to think about a kid in the most specific terms, strengths, challenges, interests, content, the more leverage you have as a teacher for identifying the kinds of tasks that are going to be challenging and the kinds of strategies or scaffolds that are going to be supportive. So I mention this now in part because you'll need to think about that a bit for part 3 of the lesson when you identify a strategy or a scaffold to support a student. But it's really important. I also mention that because it's come up for me lately. My background is as an elementary teacher and special ed and inclusive ed. So I've taught all content areas a lot, and I've thought a lot about like a kid across the day and what kinds of general strategies going to support that person's participation throughout the school day. And then in more recent times, I've been working a lot with secondary teachers. And because they stay within a content area in secondary classrooms, the ways of thinking as a teacher are actually quite different in terms of understanding how a kid relates to the content. So one of the things I've gained from doing that work with secondary teachers is the importance of including notions about content in thinking about kids, even at the elementary level. Okay. Silos, yeah, there it is. So if anyone has questions or comments about that, please feel free to chat them right now. I just wanted to get that across. Let's see. It's totally fine. I'm reading Mindy's question. The people over at Thinking Maps would say that there are 8 maps encompass all of the essential thinking processes. So most everything we do could be captured in one of them. Well, I don't know all of their thinking maps, so I can't say that off the bat. They're just one of the tools I recommend. I don't, concept maps and thinking maps. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, so it's a really interesting, and no, I'm not familiar with Goldbook, but these resources are useful, and I will look that up. So here's what my guess, my off the top of my head guess is, Minnie, and everyone else, that thinking maps, you can design and construct thinking maps to address all the features of the system, such as what you're going to see in the slides or what Craig Pullman talks about. So you can have a thinking map that focuses on critical thinking, that focuses on creativity, that focuses on problem solving, that focuses on rule use, right? You can create a thinking map for each of those. And that's probably what the thinking maps people are promoting. However, a thinking map itself is a particular type of tool that is going to be supportive of some kids and not supportive of others. So for kids that have a spatial weakness or challenge or are visually stressed, a thinking map on any of those topics will be actually not that useful. So you might then think about, oh, well, what would it mean to problem solve through a physical task? what does problem set, all those like ropes courses, or like, there's like, we got to pass this cup, but no one can use their hands kinds of tasks. That's a higher order task, but it doesn't involve language, and it doesn't involve anything written. So that's what I would say to that. Other questions or thoughts? All right, good, guys. Well, this is okay, so that's that. So I'm going to encourage you all to do this. Look at the slides. Do the Brain Basher puzzle that's in the introduction slides for this week, as I've mentioned before, but just for anyone who's having trouble still. Download the slides, please. Put them in slideshow, and then you can click the link. It'll take you to the Brain Basher's website. Otherwise, I'm just going to write it here for anyone who can't get there. It's brainbashers.com. If you go to that website, it's got like a million higher order type puzzles for you to do. And so do those. And then I want you, while you're doing that stuff, to think about your kids' content areas, variation, and complexity for this week. Oh, great. You guys should read what Mindy's suggesting too, because I don't know how many, because I'm not in the classroom. This is like good info for me to share with others, but since you guys are teaching and or working directly with teachers, you might have immediate use for it in ways that are even more important than what I've got for you. So just keep the idea. It's higher order cognition for the next couple of weeks, so it's like let's keep it complicated as much as possible. But these really kind of tricky ways of thinking about the intersection among the constructs, but also between the constructs and people, is a healthy mental exercise. And that's it. Oh, great. Oh, that's all right. I'll be looking up the Goal Book pathways too. And feel free, by the way, so far I've seen the Prim mentioned, the Goal Book mentioned tonight. When you're doing part 3 of the assignment in the final week, the intention, just so you know, is not that you need to create something from scratch. In fact, I encourage you to do that if that's something that's fun or rewarding for you. I discourage you from doing that because you think I want you to. There's a million resources out there in the wide world, and using and adapting resources in a thoughtful manner is really powerful and can kind of help teachers build up a toolbox, as opposed to thinking that we all have to reinvent wheels every time we want to meet a student's learning needs. So all I ask is that when you select strategies or modify strategies or adapt strategies, just let me know where you got it from, because it's useful information, but you don't need to create it out of nothing. Okay. And that's it for this week. So we don't have a session next week. We don't have a session next week. We have one week 6, the final week. So between now and then, if you want, feel free to contact me, let me know if you have any questions, or if you have resources you want to share with the group and you can't post them yourself via Moodle, I'm more than happy to do it for you, and just let me know. And otherwise, I hope you have a good 2 weeks, and I will see you in 2 Wednesdays. Okay? Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.